The order arrives at the Finnish regimental command post at Korpiselkä at 06:14 on the morning of December 2, 1939. It is written in the economical language that Finnish military culture has developed for situations in which the mathematics do not permit elaboration. The 34th Infantry Regiment will hold the Kollaa River line. The regiment has approximately 4,000 men. The Soviet force assembling across the tree line numbers, by Finnish intelligence estimates, something between 8,000 and 11,000 soldiers with artillery, armoured support and the logistical apparatus of an army that has already placed nearly 500,000 men inside Finland's borders. The regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Arne Snellman, reads the order. He does not comment on the ratio. He folds the paper and places it inside his coat. Outside, the temperature is -22 degrees Celsius and falling. In the spruce forest that runs to the east of the Kollaa River, the sound of Soviet vehicle engines has been audible since before dawn. The Soviet 56th Rifle Corps is preparing its assault on a front that the Finns are defending at a ratio of 1 man for every 8 meters of line. By any calculus of conventional military planning, what is about to happen should not be a battle. It should be an overrunning. What happens instead is one of the most extraordinary sustained defensive actions in the recorded history of 20th century warfare. The Kollaa River does not appear impressive on a map. It runs for approximately 32 kilometers between Lake Kollaa in the north and Lake Ladoga in the south, a modest waterway in the province of Karelia that in winter freezes enough at the edges to make crossing possible in places, though the main channel remains dark and moving beneath a skin of ice that is never reliable. The forest on both sides is boreal, dense, old, the trees growing in soil that is half-frozen peat, the understory dense with blueberry scrub and lichen-covered rock. There are no roads of consequence on the Finnish side. What passes for paths are tracks that the local men know from years of logging and hunting, paths that do not appear on Soviet military maps and that Soviet soldiers moving through this landscape would walk past without recognizing. The Finnish commanders defending Kollaa understand the geometry of this forest as intimately as they understand the geometry of their own farms. They have grown up here, they have logged here, their fathers are buried here. The Kollaa River is not a natural obstacle of any great military significance. It is simply a line that the Finnish soldiers behind it have decided is the line they will not cross. Major General Juho Haglund, commanding the IV Army Corps, to which the 34th Regiment belongs, issues his operational directive for the sector in language that strips away every military euphemism. Kollaa must hold. 3 words. Not instructions for how to hold it. Not a contingency plan if holding proves impossible. 3 words that function less as a military order than as a statement of what Finnish soldiers in the Kollaa sector are going to do, regardless of what the Soviet military planners believe is theoretically achievable against 4,000 men strung across 32 kilometers of frozen forest. The men of the 34th Infantry Regiment are not, for the most part, professional soldiers. They are farmers from the Karelian countryside, loggers, smallholders who have been growing rye and potatoes in the same clearings their grandfathers cleared. They have been in the Civil Guard since their early 20s, training on weekends and during summer exercises in the forests they have known since childhood, learning to shoot at ranges their neighbors have been shooting at since the Guard was established, handling rifles in the same hands that have been handling axes. The Finnish military system that mobilized them in October 1939 did not create soldiers out of civilians in the conventional sense. It called men back to a skill set they had been maintaining in the landscape they knew for the specific purpose of defending it. The regiment has company-level commanders who have been training with their men for years. The soldiers know their sergeants by name, have hunted with them in some cases, have worked alongside them during logging seasons. The unit cohesion of the 34th Infantry Regiment is not the product of a military system. It is the product of a community that has been preparing, with varying degrees of official structure, to fight in this forest since Finnish independence in 1917. Lieutenant Colonel Snellman is 43 years old. He is a career officer of the type that the Finnish Defence Forces have produced in limited but carefully selected numbers. Technically trained, personally austere, possessed of the particular quality that Finnish military culture values above almost any other, which is the capacity to make a decision under uncertainty and to hold to it when the situation deteriorates. He has studied the Kollaa sector in detail since his regiment was assigned to its defense in October. He knows where the Soviet forces will try to cross the river. He knows the 3 or 4 points at which the ice is firm enough in early December to support infantry, and the 2 points at which it might support a light armored vehicle. He knows which sections of his line can be reinforced quickly using the forest paths his men know, and which sections are isolated enough that a breakthrough there would have to be contained by whatever local reserve he can scrape together. He has deployed his 4,000 men not as a continuous line in the conventional military sense, but as a series of strong points, fortified positions built from the timber of the forest itself, connected by a network of paths and communication trenches that his soldiers have been digging and improving since October. Between the strong points, the forest is the defense, the forest and the men who know it. On December 1st, 1939, the Soviet 56th Rifle Corps begins its first serious probing of the Kollaa Line. The corps is commanded by Major General Vladimir Kipichnikov, an officer of the Red Army who has spent his career in the institution that Stalin's purges have spent 2 years systematically hollowing out. Kipichnikov is not unintelligent. He is not without military experience, but he commands a force that has inherited from the catastrophic reorganization of the Soviet officer corps a specific institutional pathology, the inability to process what is actually happening in front of him and report it accurately upward, because accurate reporting of failure in Stalin's Red Army is a path to consequences that his predecessors have made very clear. The 56th Rifle Corps crosses into Finland on November 30th with approximately 11,000 men in its initial assault elements, supported by artillery that the Finnish defenders can hear but cannot yet accurately locate, and by the beginning of December, the Soviet probing actions against the Kollaa Line have already produced the first data point that Kipichnikov's headquarters will spend the next 3 months failing to properly interpret. The probing actions cost more than they should. The Finnish positions are not where Soviet intelligence has placed them. The men defending those positions do not behave the way Soviet tactical doctrine predicts defenders will behave. When a Soviet probing company pushes toward the river, it does not encounter a linear defense that can be pressed until it breaks. It encounters nothing, silence, forest, the creak of frozen trees, until it reaches a point that the Finns have decided is the point at which contact is tactically advantageous, and then it encounters fire from 3 directions simultaneously from positions it cannot locate. The company withdraws. It reports that it has encountered Finnish defensive positions. It reports this accurately. What it cannot report accurately is what those positions consist of, because it has not seen them. It has only seen the effects of them. Men dead in the snow, in the positions they occupied when the rounds arrived, facing a tree line from which no muzzle flash was visible. Kipichnikov orders a more substantial push on December 4th. 2 full battalions, approximately 1,000 men, on a front of roughly 3 kilometers, centered on a section of the Kollaa where his engineers have assessed the ice as crossable. The battalions move out at 07:30 in the grey half-light of the Finnish December morning, when the sun has not yet fully cleared the tree line and the light is flat and colourless, and the snow absorbs what little contrast exists between objects. The Finnish observation posts note the movement at 07:41. The information moves through Finnish communication lines with a speed that surprises Soviet observers who have studied Finnish military capability and concluded it is rudimentary. The Finnish system is not sophisticated in the technological sense. It is a network of men who know the terrain and who have spent months developing communications protocols for exactly this situation. At RA 802, as the lead Soviet battalion reaches the near bank of the Kollaa and begins its crossing on the ice, the Finnish defensive fire opens from positions that the Soviet commanders, studying the tree line from the rear, will spend the rest of the morning being unable to locate. The fire is not the fire of men with inadequate training shooting in panic at movement. It is the fire of men who have known this crossing point for years, who have rehearsed its defense in their minds and in exercises since October, who know the exact range to every point on the ice and have their weapons adjusted accordingly. The lead Soviet battalion takes approximately 140 casualties in the first 9 minutes of the crossing attempt. The 2nd Battalion, watching from the near bank, stops. Its commander sends a runner back with a request for artillery support. The runner takes 22 minutes to reach the artillery coordinator. By the time the Soviet artillery begins finding the Finnish positions, the Finnish soldiers have moved. This is the tactical signature of the Kollaa defense, repeated over 97 days with variations that the Soviet commanders find increasingly difficult to adapt to. The Finns are never in the position that the Soviet artillery has located by the time the rounds arrive. They have moved to the secondary positions that their knowledge of the terrain makes available, positions that Soviet maps do not show and that Soviet soldiers moving through this forest at night cannot find. The Finnish defensive line is not a line in the conventional sense. It is an organism that breathes. It contracts when Soviet pressure reaches unsustainable levels, falls back 20 or 30 meters to a prepared alternative position, and then counterattacks the moment the Soviets believe they have taken ground. Finnish soldiers counterattack immediately and violently when any section of their position is entered, before Soviet forces can consolidate, before Soviet commanders can order the follow-up exploitation that conventional military doctrine calls for. The window between a Soviet penetration and a Finnish counterattack is measured in minutes. It is a window too narrow for the Soviet command structure, operating with the communication delays and approval requirements that characterize a military built on fear of initiative to exploit. The broader picture of what Finland is facing in December 1939 is one that the men of the 34th Infantry Regiment understand only in fragments. They know that the Soviet Union has attacked along the entire length of the Finnish border simultaneously. They know that the Mannerheim line on the Karelian Isthmus is under enormous pressure. They know that further north, in the wilderness around Suomussalmi and the Raati Road, something is happening to Soviet forces that has not yet fully revealed itself. What they are living in the Kollaa sector is their portion of that larger story. A nation of approximately 3.5 million people, defended by a military of approximately 300,000, absorbing the assault of a force that has deployed more than 21 divisions with 6,000 tanks and 3,800 aircraft in its initial wave alone. The Finnish military cannot defeat this force in any encounter that resembles conventional battle. It can only make the cost of overrunning Finland so consistently and catastrophically expensive that the arithmetic of conquest becomes untenable. The 34th Infantry Regiment's assignment is to make the Kollaa sector a place where that arithmetic operates in Finland's favor, against forces that outnumber them by a ratio that no military planning manual in 1939 contains a doctrine for defending at Ossa. 700 kilometers to the northwest. In Moscow, the military situation is the subject of conversations that are becoming, by early December, dangerously honest. The Red Army's advance into Finland has not gone as planned on any axis. The Mannerheim line has not fallen. The forests of central Finland are consuming Soviet divisions. The 9th Army, which was supposed to cut Finland in half by driving west across the country's waste, has been halted and in some sectors thrown back by Finnish forces that, according to every Soviet intelligence assessment, should not have been capable of halting it. General Kirill Meretskov, commanding the Northwestern Front, is writing reports to Moscow that contain the specific verbal formulations that Soviet military officers have learned to deploy when they need to describe failure without describing failure in terms that will get them shot. The campaign is proceeding according to adjusted timelines. The Finnish resistance is more substantial than anticipated in the initial assessment. The weather conditions are complicating operational execution. These formulations arrive in Moscow. Stalin reads them. The distance between what these formulations say and what they mean is understood by everyone in the room. What Merezkov's reports cannot convey, and what no report written inside the Soviet system can convey, is the specific quality of what Finnish soldiers are doing to Soviet forces across the front. It is not that the Finns are braver. It is not that they are better equipped. It is that they are operating in an environment they understand completely, while their opponents understand it almost not at all, and that this asymmetry of knowledge produces battlefield effects that the Soviet military system, designed for operations on the open plains of Ukraine and Poland, has no prepared doctrine for countering. In the Kollaa sector, this asymmetry is playing out in its most concentrated form. 4,000 men defending 32 kilometers of forest against 11,000, and the 11,000 cannot make their numbers decisive because the forest will not let them. The Soviet crossing attempts continue through the first 2 weeks of December with increasing frequency and decreasing success. By December 8th, the 56th Rifle Corps has made 11 separate attempts to cross the Kollaa River in force, and 11 times the Finnish defensive fire has broken each attempt before it can establish a foothold on the western bank. The Finnish losses in these engagements are not negligible. The 34th Regiment is losing men it cannot replace quickly. Finland's manpower pool is finite, and the demands on it are total. But the Soviet losses are proportionally greater, and the greater loss is not measured only in the dead. The Soviet soldiers who survived these crossing attempts carry something back with them across the ice that no after-action report accurately quantifies. The specific knowledge of what it feels like to cross a Finnish defensive line in daylight, to watch the men on either side of you drop in rapid sequence from fire whose source you cannot locate, to reach the western bank and find that you are there alone because the column that was behind you has stopped and the men who were beside you are in the snow and the forest ahead is silent and watching. This knowledge does not leave men. It changes how they move, how they respond to orders, how they assess the probability of surviving the next order to advance. Corporal Aino Mäkinen is 26 years old from the village of Tomajärvi, 20 kilometers west of the Kollaa River. He has been farming his family's fields since his father died in 1932, growing potatoes and rye and keeping 3 dairy cattle, spending his winters in the logging camps to the north where the pay is adequate and the work is the kind that produces a particular physical competence, the ability to move through deep snow while carrying weight, to judge distances in low light through a forest canopy, to work in extreme cold without losing the fine motor coordination that precise work requires. He has been in the Civic Guard since he was 19. He handles his M2830 rifle with the automatic familiarity of a man who has been shooting with it for years in these same forests, at ranges he has measured himself, in light conditions he has learned to compensate for. He is not a remarkable soldier. He is what the 34th Infantry Regiment's fighting strength actually consists of. Men with this specific combination of physical conditioning, environmental knowledge, and weapons familiarity who are defending the specific landscape in which all of these capabilities were formed. Mäkinen is assigned to the 2nd Company's position on a slight rise west of the Kollaa's central crossing point, in a log-reinforced fighting position he helped build in October. He can see approximately 200 meters across the river to the eastern bank, which means he can see the ice where it is firm and the dark patches where it is not, and he can see the gap in the tree line on the eastern bank where the Soviet paths converge on this crossing point. He has been watching this gap for weeks. He knows what it looks like when it is empty. He knows what it looks like when it contains something that should not be there. On the morning of December 11th at 07:18, the gap contains something that should not be there, and Mäkinen knows it before the Soviet soldiers emerge from the tree line, because the birds that have been feeding at the forest edge since before dawn have risen in a single mass and moved south. And in the Karelian forest in winter, birds do not move like that without a reason. He notifies his section leader by field telephone. The section leader notifies the company commander. By 07:24, 3 minutes before the Soviet advance party reaches the eastern bank of the Kollaa, the Finnish defensive position on this section of the river is at full readiness, men in their positions, weapons cleared of frost, the specific stillness that trained soldiers achieve in the moments before engagement. The Soviet advance party is a company of approximately 120 men from the 217th Rifle Regiment, tasked with establishing a bridgehead on the western bank. They have been briefed that the Finnish positions on this section of the river have been suppressed by the artillery preparation of the previous night. The artillery preparation was conducted by Soviet guns firing at coordinates derived from intelligence assessments that are 2 weeks old. The Finnish positions were at those coordinates 2 weeks ago. They have been moved, modified, reinforced, and in some cases abandoned and replaced in the interval. The intelligence that the Soviet artillery preparation is acting on is a map of where Finnish soldiers used to be, not where they are. This is a failure mode that will characterize Soviet operations in the Kollaa sector for the entire duration of the Winter War, and that the Finnish defenders have learned to exploit systematically by never remaining in the position that Soviet observers have had the opportunity to locate. The company crosses. The first elements reach the western bank at 07:31. Finnish fire opens at 07:32. The engagement lasts 11 minutes. Of the 120 men who crossed, 37 make it back to the eastern bank. The rest are on the ice or in the shallow snow of the western bank, in the positions they occupied when the rounds reached them. Finnish losses on this section: 2 men wounded, neither life-threatening. This ratio, and it is a ratio that appears in Finnish after-action reports for this sector, with a consistency that military historians have noted as virtually without precedent in modern warfare, reflects not Finnish supernatural ability, but Finnish positional advantage, so complete that the engagement is structurally unequal before the first shot is fired. By December 15th, the 56th Rifle Corps has exhausted its initial assault concept. Kirpichnikov convenes a commander's conference at his corps headquarters in a requisitioned farmhouse 12 kilometers east of the Kollaa, and the report he produces for the Northwestern Front is a document that requires careful reading between its bureaucratically careful lines. The Corps has suffered approximately 2,800 casualties in 16 days of operations. The Kollaa River line has not been crossed. Finnish defensive positions have not been identified with sufficient accuracy for artillery to neutralize them. Finnish counter-attack capability has been demonstrated to be more rapid and more violent than the initial operational plan anticipated. The report recommends a period of consolidation, reinforcement, and operational replanning before the next major assault. What the report does not say, because saying it would constitute a form of professional suicide, is that the 56th Rifle Corps has been methodically destroyed in detail by a force less than half its size, in a landscape that the Finnish defenders treat as home, and that the Soviet soldiers treat as a hostile alien environment that is trying to kill them even when the Finns are not shooting. In the Kollaa sector in December 1939, the temperature drops to -35°C on the nights of the 17th and 18th. Soviet soldiers in the forward positions, who have been unable to establish adequate shelter because Finnish fire makes construction under observation impossible, spend these nights in whatever cover they have improvised, burning whatever fuel they can find, frostbite working through fingers and ears and feet with the thoroughness of an additional enemy that requires no weapons and makes no sound. Finnish medical officers on the Western Bank estimate from observation and from the few prisoners taken that cold casualties in the Soviet forward positions during this period may equal or exceed combat casualties. This estimate is broadly consistent with what Soviet medical records, examined decades later by historians, show. The Red Army in December 1939 in Finland is fighting two adversaries simultaneously, and the one it did not bring ammunition for may be the more dangerous. Lieutenant Colonel Snellman is managing his 4,000 men across 32 kilometers with the particular skill that the Kollaa defense requires. Not the skill of the offensive commander who allocates resources to achieve concentration at the decisive point, but the skill of the defensive commander whose decisive point shifts constantly as Soviet pressure probes first one sector and then another, who must maintain reserves that can move quickly enough through the forest to reinforce any section of the line before a Soviet penetration can be exploited, who must rotate his men between forward positions and rear areas without creating gaps that Soviet reconnaissance can identify. He is sleeping 4 hours a night. His staff officers are sleeping 3. The regimental aid station is treating frostbite and combat wounds with equal frequency. The men of the 34th Regiment are not suffering less than their Soviet opponents. They are suffering differently, the suffering of men who know they are in their own landscape, defending their own farms, with no option and no desire to be anywhere else. The Finnish understanding of their own situation in December 1939 is unclouded by the optimism that propaganda produces. The men of the Kollaa sector do not believe they can defeat the Soviet Union. They do not believe that Finland will emerge from this war without concessions. What they believe, what every Finnish soldier on every sector of the front understands with a clarity that their political leaders in Helsinki are still working toward, is that the cost Finland extracts for every meter of its territory will determine what is left of Finland when the war ends. The Finnish strategy is not victory. It is survival by making conquest too expensive. Every Soviet soldier stopped at the Kollaa River is a soldier who is not crossing into the Finnish interior. Every day the 34th Regiment holds its line is a day that Finland exists as a functioning state rather than a Soviet military occupation. These men are not fighting for an abstract principle. They are fighting because their farms are 20 kilometers west of where they are standing. And the thing that is trying to get to those farms is currently trying to cross a frozen river, and they are going to stop it. On December 19th, the Soviet 56th Rifle Corps receives its reinforcements. Elements of the 168th Rifle Division, approximately 6,000 men, bringing the total Soviet strength in the Kollaa sector to something that Finnish intelligence estimates at close to 17,000. Kipichnikov plans a coordinated assault on 3 sectors of the Kollaa line simultaneously, designed to prevent Finnish reserves from reinforcing any single penetration by threatening all of them at once. It is a sound operational concept. It is the concept that Soviet doctrine recommends for breaking through a thinly held defensive line. And it is the concept that the Soviet assault on the Karelian Isthmus has been applying against the Mannerheim line with the weight of 21 divisions and 6,000 artillery pieces. In the Kollaa sector, Kipichnikov has approximately 17,000 men and an artillery complement that is substantial but not overwhelming. He also has, though he does not know it yet, a plan that is predicated on assumptions about Finnish defensive behavior that the previous 3 weeks have already demonstrated to be false. The assault begins at 05:45 on December 22nd, preceded by an artillery preparation of 40 minutes that the Finnish defenders absorb from their log-reinforced positions, men lying flat in the bottom of their trenches while Soviet shells tear apart the frozen trees above them, splinters of spruce and pine falling across the snow in the silence between rounds. The artillery preparation is more effective than previous preparatory fires. Kipichnikov's artillery officers have spent 3 weeks studying Finnish defensive positions and have identified locations with a greater degree of accuracy than their predecessors. Finnish casualties during the preparation are higher than on any previous day of the defense. One company position on the northern section of the line takes a direct hit on its command post, killing the company commander and 2 of his officers. The section of the line this position anchors is briefly without effective command. At the moment the Soviet infantry begins its advance. What happens in that northern sector in the 90 minutes that follow the Soviet assault's opening is the most dangerous moment the Kollaa defense faces in the first month of the war. Soviet infantry crosses the Kollaa on the northern section, reaches the western bank, and pushes through the gap created by the destruction of the Finnish command post. For a period of approximately 40 minutes, Soviet soldiers are on the western bank of the Kollaa in organized strength, moving inland, pushing toward the Finnish rear areas. The gap in the Finnish line is approximately 400 meters wide. If it widens, if Soviet forces can feed a regiment through it before Finnish reserves arrive, the entire northern section of the Kollaa defense becomes untenable, and behind that section are the forest paths that lead to the supply depots and command posts of the Finnish rearward positions, and behind those are the roads that lead west into the Finnish interior. Snellman is informed of the breakthrough at 06:31. By 6:35, he has ordered his only uncommitted reserve, 2 companies of approximately 350 men who have been resting in a rear position since midnight, to move immediately to the breakthrough point. The reserve companies move through the forest on the paths they know, paths that Soviet forces moving cross-country from the river cannot know, paths that allow a Finnish soldier on foot in winter to cover ground at a speed that astonishes anyone who has not seen Finnish soldiers move in their own forest. The reserve arrives at the penetration point at 07:02, 27 minutes from Snellman's order to contact with the Soviet force that has crossed. The 2 companies do not stop to assess the situation. They counterattack immediately, directly into the flank of the Soviet force that has crossed before it has had time to consolidate, before its supporting elements have completed the crossing, before its commanders have had the minutes they need to receive reports, assess the situation, and issue the follow-on orders that would allow the penetration to become a breakthrough. The Finnish counterattack hits the Soviet force in the flank at 07:04. The engagement lasts 31 minutes. At 07:35, the last Soviet soldier on the western bank of the Kollaa in the northern sector is either dead, wounded, or back across the river. The penetration has lasted 64 minutes. It has not become a breakthrough. The gap in the Finnish line is closed, not with fresh units from reserve. The reserve is now committed, but with the survivors of the companies that held the adjacent positions, who have moved laterally through the forest to cover the gap while the reserve engaged the Soviet force in the open. By 09 Assyrians, the Soviet 3-sector assault has been halted on all 3 axes. The central and southern crossing attempts, which faced Finnish positions that were not disrupted by the artillery preparation, produced casualties at rates comparable to the previous 3 weeks. The northern penetration has been sealed. The total Finnish casualties for December 22nd are 73 killed and 112 wounded, the highest single-day loss the regiment has sustained in 3 weeks of combat. The Soviet casualties for the same day are, by Finnish estimates and Soviet records examined after the war, approximately 850 dead and wounded across all 3 sectors. Kirpichnikov reports the assault results to the Northwestern Front with the phrasing that his career has taught him to deploy for results like these. The assault has achieved limited territorial objectives before consolidating in response to Finnish counter-attack pressures. The Northwestern Front passes this assessment to Moscow in its own formulation. Moscow reads it, Stalin reads it. What none of these reports can convey, because the Soviet military system lacks the language for it, is that 4,000 men have just stopped 17,000 for the 4th time in 3 weeks, and that the 4,000 are still in the same positions they occupied on December 2nd. Christmas 1939 arrives on the Kollaa River with a cold that has dropped to -38 degrees Celsius. Finnish soldiers in their positions light small fires in the bottoms of their trenches, fires small enough to produce no visible smoke above the tree line, fires maintained with the careful economy of men who understand that every unnecessary piece of wood burned in warmth is a piece of wood not available for maintaining body temperature through a night that the temperature will not allow survival without it. They eat their rations from tins that must be held against the body for 20 minutes to thaw before the food can be consumed. They maintain their weapons with the compulsive attention of men who know that, at these temperatures, a poorly maintained bolt-action rifle is a liability, not an asset. They sleep in rotation 2 hours at a time, never enough, never warm, but continuous in their presence on the line, because Finnish military culture has produced, in these men, an understanding that the line is what stands between what they are protecting and what is trying to reach it. On the eastern bank, the Soviet positions are alive with a different quality of suffering. Soviet soldiers in the forward positions, most of them from climates significantly warmer than this one, are experiencing the Finnish winter as a physical adversary as active as the enemy across the river. By Christmas 1939, Soviet medical reports from the Kollaa sector describe frostbite casualties that have in some units reached 30% of forward deployed strength. Men who have lost toes or fingers to frostbite are being evacuated, and the men replacing them are arriving from positions further east who have not yet experienced what the Finnish winter actually means at the unit level, who are going through the same learning process their predecessors went through, acquiring the same practical knowledge of what -35 degrees does to a human body when the body is insufficiently clothed and the shelter is inadequate, at the same speed their predecessors acquired it, paying the same price. The Soviet logistics system that is supposed to be providing adequate winter clothing and equipment to the Kollaa sector is failing, as it is failing across the front, because it was designed for a campaign of 12 to 15 days and has now been asked to sustain a campaign of indefinite duration in conditions it was not built for. January 1940 brings a change in Soviet operational approach that reflects the slow, grinding recognition, never openly stated in any document that a Soviet officer's career could survive writing, that the methods of the first month have not worked. Kipichnikov is not replaced, but he receives a new set of instructions from the Northwestern Front that amount to a different operational concept for the Kollaa sector. Rather than attempting to cross the river with mass infantry assaults, Soviet forces are to probe the Finnish line with smaller units, identify defensive positions, and work toward a methodical attrition of Finnish strength that the arithmetic of the war eventually makes sustainable. The Finnish army has a fixed and finite number of men. The Soviet Union does not, in any operationally meaningful sense. If the Kollaa sector cannot be forced quickly, it can perhaps be worn down slowly if the price of wearing it down is paid consistently, and the Finnish replacements are consumed faster than they arrive. This concept is operationally sound. It is the concept that Timoshenko, when he takes command of the Northwestern Front in January, applies with devastating effect on the Karelian Isthmus, concentrating mass and patience where the Kollaa sector commander has been concentrating mass and impatience. In the Kollaa sector specifically, however, it runs into the same obstacle that every Soviet operational concept in this sector runs into: the terrain. The terrain does not permit small Soviet units to probe Finnish positions without accepting the same positional disadvantages that large Soviet units have been accepting since December 2nd. A Soviet patrol that enters the Finnish forest encounters the same darkness, the same cold, the same invisible opponents, and the same fire from positions it cannot locate, whether the patrol is 20 men or 200. The information these patrols can gather about Finnish defensive positions is limited by the same factor that has limited every previous attempt at reconnaissance. Finnish soldiers in this forest are simply not visible unless they choose to be, and they do not choose to be visible to Soviet reconnaissance patrols. Sergeant Paavo Korhonen is 31 years old, from a farm near Wärtsilä. 15 kilometers north of the Kollaa River's middle sector. He has been in the Civic Guard since he was 18 and has spent more of his adult life in these forests during guard exercises than he can accurately calculate. He commands a section of 8 men on the northern sector of the Kollaa Line, the same sector where the December 22nd penetration was sealed. His section has been on the line since December 2nd without rotation, living in the same log-reinforced position they built in October, fighting from it, maintaining it, sleeping in shifts in the fighting trench because the temperature does not permit sleep in an unheated position without the specific physiological adaptation that only continuous exposure produces. Karelian's section has lost 2 men in the first month of the defense. 1 killed, 1 evacuated with severe frostbite after a night patrol in which his gloves were torn by wire and the temperature did the rest. The 6 men remaining are in the condition that soldiers under sustained defensive pressure achieve. Not good, not well rested, not comfortable, but functional in the specific way that men become functional when they have no alternative. They have learned in a month of daily engagement with Soviet probing and Soviet attacks the particular skills of their specific section of the line. Where Soviet patrols tend to approach, what sounds in the forest at night indicate movement rather than wind, at what angle the weak winter light creates the shadows that make a moving figure visible against the snow. They have learned these things the way soldiers learn things in combat, through accumulated operational experience that no training exercise can fully replicate. Experience earned at a cost that training does not charge, but combat does. In February 1940, the character of the Soviet pressure on the Kollaa changes as Timoshenko's reorganization of the Northwestern Front begins to produce results further south. The Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus, under the weight of the most concentrated artillery bombardment in Finnish military history, is cracking. Finnish reserve units that might have been used to reinforce the Kollaa sector are being consumed on the isthmus faster than they can be replaced. The Finnish government in Helsinki, which has been conducting the secret diplomatic contacts that might produce a negotiated peace since January, is moving toward terms that Finnish military commanders understand will require the cession of territory that the soldiers defending it are still actively defending. The men of the 34th Regiment do not know the specific details of these negotiations. They know the strategic situation has deteriorated. They know the Mannerheim Line is not holding. They know that the logic of the war, which has always been about imposing maximum cost rather than achieving conventional military victory, is reaching the phase in which the Finnish government must decide what it has purchased with that cost. They hold the Kollaa Line because the line has not been taken from them, and because holding it is what they were ordered to do, and because in Finnish military culture, an order to hold a position is honored until a different order arrives, regardless of what is happening on other sectors of the front. On February 12th, the Mannerheim Line breaks. The Finnish withdrawal from the isthmus begins, orderly but irreversible, toward the second defensive line that was never designed to be permanent. The war is entering its final phase. The question being negotiated in Helsinki is not whether Finland will fight on, but at what cost and with what territorial price the fighting will stop. On the Kollaa, the 34th Regiment is still in the positions it occupied on December 2nd. Snellman receives no order to withdraw. He issues no order to withdraw. The regiment holds. The Soviets, sensing the strategic shift and pressing their advantage on the isthmus, do not substantially increase the pressure on the Kollaa sector in February. The weight of their operational effort is concentrated where the strategic decision is being sought, not in the secondary sector where a Finnish regiment has spent 3 months demonstrating that the decision cannot be sought there. Kapitchnikov's forces continue their probing, their patrol activity, their occasional artillery preparations, followed by infantry pushes that the Finns turn back with the same systematic efficiency they have been demonstrating since December. But the scale of the February operations in the Kollaa sector is lower than December or January, and the Finnish defenders, by February, are performing their defense with the automated competence of men who have been doing the same thing for so long that its execution no longer requires the conscious allocation of attention. They hold their positions. They rotate their men. They maintain their weapons. They watch the frozen river and the tree line beyond it, and they wait for whatever comes next, and they stop it when it comes. The Moscow Peace Treaty is signed on March 13, 1940. Finland cedes approximately 11% of its territory, including the Karelian Isthmus and significant areas further north. The territorial losses are substantial. They include land that Finnish soldiers have been defending with their lives for 105 days. The Finnish military ceases offensive and defensive operations at noon on March the 13th. On the Kollaa River, the 34th Infantry Regiment stands down from its positions at the appointed hour. The men who walk back from the fighting positions to the rear area are not the same men who took those positions on December the 2nd. They are harder, quieter, reduced in number, carrying in their faces and movements the specific quality that 3.5 months of continuous combat in extreme cold produces in the survivors. They have not been relieved. They have not been reinforced to the point where their numbers match the Soviet forces opposing them. They have held 32 kilometers of river line against forces that, at their peak concentration in the sector, exceeded 11,000 men with artillery support and armored elements, with the full institutional weight of the largest military organization on Earth. They have held it for 97 days. They have held it without withdrawing a single kilometer. The final casualty figures for the Kollaa sector, compiled from Finnish military records, are studied by military historians for what they reveal about the economics of the defense. The 34th Infantry Regiment and the associated units defending the sector suffered approximately 1,200 killed and wounded in the period from December 2, 1939 to March 13, 1940. Soviet casualties in the sector, estimated from Soviet records and Finnish after-action reports, are placed by historians at between 8,000 and 12,000, depending on the methodology used and the category of losses included. The range is wide, partly because Soviet record-keeping in this sector was imprecise in ways that reflect the institutional dysfunction of the Soviet military command, and partly because cold casualties, men evacuated for frostbite and hypothermia, were recorded separately from combat casualties in Soviet documents, and the distinction between the two was not always clean in practice. What the records agree on across Finnish and Soviet sources examined by researchers in the decades after the war is that the ratio of loss in the Kollaa sector favored the Finnish defenders at every point in the campaign, by a margin that conventional military analysis does not have a ready explanation for. That does not begin and end with the terrain and the men who knew it. There is a coda to the Kollaa defense that Finnish military historians note without sentimentality. The territory that the 34th Infantry Regiment defended for 97 days is ceded to the Soviet Union under the Moscow Peace Treaty. The farms that the men of the regiment were defending, the farms 20 kilometers west that represented the specific, concrete, unheroic reason most of them were standing in a trench in the forest, survived the war. They survived the war in Finnish hands because the regiment held the line long enough for the peace negotiations to conclude before the Soviet forces in the sector could push through to them. This is what the defense of the Kollaa purchased. Not a military victory, not a strategic reversal, but an additional 97 days of existence for the communities behind the line. In Finnish terms, in the winter of 1939 to 1940, this is sufficient. It is, in fact, the whole point. Major General Haglund writes in his operational summary of the Kollaa sector defense that the regiment held a position that every conventional military principle said could not be held, for a duration that conventional military planning would not have predicted, against a force that conventional military arithmetic said was decisive. He writes this not as a tribute to supernatural Finnish virtue, but as an observation about the limits of conventional military principles when applied to unconventional terrain, unconventional defenders, and a set of conditions that the attacking force's institutional structure was unable to adapt to with sufficient speed. The Kollaa line held because Snellman and his officers made good decisions under extreme pressure. It held because the Finnish soldiers defending it possessed exactly the knowledge and the physical capability that this specific landscape, in this specific season, required. And it held because the Soviet military system that was trying to take it was designed for a different war, in a different landscape, against a different opponent, and discovered this at every crossing point of every frozen river in Finland, but most completely, most consistently, and most completely on the Kollaa. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Here is the debate that military historians still argue about. Was the Kollaa defense the most cost-effective defensive action in the Winter War? Or does Siilasvuo's destruction of 2 full Soviet divisions at Suomussalmi hold that distinction? And is there a difference when you look at what each cost? Drop your answer below and watch this next video.